The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here with us to speak about the transit talent gaps that exist. We're really happy to have you here. It's great to see so many of you were able to join us this afternoon, which is fantastic. My name is Andy Baskerville, and I'm a product marketing manager here at Bonfire. And along with me today, I've got Anthony Berry, and Anthony Berry is our solutions engineer. And we're really excited to have him here with us today because Anthony has worked with countless transit organizations across the US and Canada as well. And I can't think of a better person here at Bonfire to help speak with us about the transit talent gap and really what the implications that are. So Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me, Andy. And yeah, looking forward to going through this with everyone online.
Fantastic. Well, we can go ahead and jump straight into the agenda here. And what we're going to start with is talking about really what is the talent gap? What does it mean? And what are the implications for your transportation procurement team? Then we're going to get into Bonfire a bit and help show you how eSourcing can help you alleviate some of the pain points that are created by this gap. We're going to do some demoing of our own software as well to help illustrate what that can look like. And then at the end of the time that we have on the session today, we have the opportunity to field some questions if you have any. We do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're going to try and keep this session to under the hour that we have booked, but we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. And if we don't get to your question, don't despair. We'll be sure to reach out to you with the response as soon as that we're able to. So without further ado, let's just dive in. And I'm going to sort of set the stage a little bit for us here. So when we talk about the talent gap, what exactly do we mean? Well, this refers in reality to the fact that most teams don't have enough staff or resources to meet the demands of their time. And there are a variety of reasons for this. And I think first and foremost, and I'm sensing that there's going to be a lot of nodding heads on the line, we're seeing workloads increase across the board, especially in transportation. Teams are being asked to handle higher volumes or higher complexities of projects. But at the same time, the headcount of the staff of the team is staying the same, or in some cases, it could be shrinking as vacant roles go unfilled. So whether it's growth in your own agency that's resulting in more projects coming in and going through procurement, or potentially an increased amount of centralization of your procurement activities and your contracting responsibility within your agency, the bottom line here is that there's a lot to do and just not enough people or bandwidth to do it. And as a result, teams are finding themselves really stretched. And on top of that, there are a few other workforce trends that are exacerbating that challenge for procurement. So starting with retirements and turnover, we've been hearing about it for years, but we're really starting to see the effect of baby boomers retiring in large numbers from the public sector as a whole. And the transportation sector is not immune to this either. As Maine CIO put it, there's about 3,000 years of experience that's going to be walking out the door with these retirees. So if you think about how much institutional knowledge is at risk of being lost, you can understand how these retirements can have an impact not only on bandwidth, but also on knowledge and experience and being able to bring that to bear with your procurement projects. We're also seeing more cases of staff becoming burnt out. So from a GovWin survey, the percentage of government purchasing staff who reported being overworked has been steadily climbing. It was 35% in 2016. It's up to 42% last year, 2018. And to some extent, this space is starting to look and feel a lot more like a technology startup rather than what we traditionally think of as a government and how it operates. And there's a much more increased or heavier expectation on the hours and workloads that are being expected of procurement team members. And this can often lead to team members feeling burnt out, feeling overworked, and not being able to perform at their highest capability. There's also the ever-present challenge here of competing with the private sector. It's not uncommon for talented employees to, especially of a senior level, to be leaving government positions and be heading to the private sector. So for all of these reasons, there's a lot of staffing challenges happening in procurement. That's part of this talent gap that we're talking about. Whenever this kind of turnover happens, these positions are either being backfilled or they go unfilled in many cases, leaving the remaining staff to divide up the responsibilities of those that have left. Or alternatively, you have to be trying to find somebody new. And that in itself presents its own challenges. Finding staff, as I'm sure you can understand, it's difficult to find people who know how the space works, who can navigate the complexities of procurement, especially in transportation. And that's a huge obstacle that teams are coming across when they're trying to fill this gap. I mean, I don't have to tell you, we're talking about federal and state laws, we're talking about procurement policies, the rules and regulations of various grants. So we're talking about things like DVE status, Buy America, testing and safety standards. I could keep, the list goes on, but it's a very complex area and it requires a lot of expertise to be able to navigate it really effectively. Research from the Volco Alliance on public sector procurement helped to outline some of these findings. And you can see this on screen here. What we're seeing are the results from some interviews that they conducted with procurement professionals in different workforce segments, including transportation. And they were asked to provide their confidence in how capable or how competent they felt the workforce as a whole was in terms of delivering on some key areas such as policies, contracting, negotiation, supplier engagement, and you can see all those on screen. The ones I want to draw some attention to here are that only 62% of those interviewed felt that the workforce as a whole was competent when it came to process and policy comprehension. So that means that only just over half felt that as a whole, the workforce was capable and competent in ensuring that process and policies were understood really well. So we're talking about grants, and we're talking about compliance to regulations around purchasing, and that's a pretty terrifying statistic. A couple more that I want to draw your attention to here are 26% felt that there was competency in project management, and a more alarming 14% said that there was competency in risk analysis and management. And my purpose of bringing these up is that as much as these seem like terrifying stats, I think we can all agree that these are not just nice to have skills for transportation procurement. These are keys to the job. These are things that need to be occurring in transportation procurement specifically to ensure that we're being successful in finding the best outcomes. And finding staff that have these competencies, have these skill sets, is becoming very difficult. Well, that's a lot of me talking. My goal here is to get Anthony sharing his wisdom with us as well. So Anthony, if you could help talk us through, we've talked a lot about what these gaps are. We've talked a lot about where these gaps exist. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the implications of these gaps and how teams in procurement, transportation procurement might be feeling this?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, just from my perspective and with some of the teams that I've been working with, it seems like the three key things that teams are considering when it comes to actually not just driving change, but just driving a functional business is looking at the people. But then the two factors that are affecting how those people work are of course, the process that they need to abide by, and also the technology that's either supporting them or inhibiting them. So the first thing is we got to make sure that we have enough people, or that we have enough bandwidth, to cover the work that's needed. So making sure we have the right number of people is step number one. And of course, the implication of not having enough people or not having enough people with the right experiences, we're going to be putting more work on the existing staff that exists, which is going to increase the rate of burnout. It's just going to make it where we're creating less than ideal work conditions for those people to thrive in, but also less than ideal work conditions just to actually be productive in. When I think about the two other factors that I brought up, so one of them being process, especially in transportation procurement, abiding by FTA regulations, making sure that we're spending that grant money correctly. This is a critical aspect of any type of transit procurement success. So if we're not actually putting people in a position to follow that process, then I mean, we're at risk for losing grant money. We're at risk for not making these right decisions. And what we're seeing overwhelmingly is teams are losing autonomy when it actually comes to buying, where we're becoming more reliant on cooperatives and losing that agency to negotiate and drive value. The last thing that I want to talk about here is just in terms of how this can affect the people in terms of your hiring and the gaps that exist is how the technology exists that actually supports them. The reality is the status quo when it comes to transportation procurement is most teams are making their most difficult decisions on paper in Excel.
Right.
So just to kind of put it all and tie it up here, Andy, based on what you've been saying. So we have a climate where there's less people than ever before with less experience to handle this complex process, and we haven't made any advances in terms of the technology that's actually being brought in to support them. So the whole idea is how can we put our teams in a position to be successful? And I think that's really what this webinar is about, is how those three different factors can come together to put, again, procurement in a position to be successful, and of course the ripple effect that that has across the rest of the functional, components of a transit company.
No, absolutely. No, well put, Anthony. Thank you so much. And I think this quote on screen really helps sum this up, is talking about, this is probably a situation that most of us on the line here are experiencing, which is that idea that I'm being asked to do more, to provide turnarounds that still meet my business objectives, but that sense of not wanting to be the roadblock, that these capability gaps are not preventing you from finding that success that Anthony was just talking about and meeting those objectives. Well put, Anthony. And that really leads really well into our poll question, because, in terms of the rest of today's session, I want to make sure that, we're helping to tailor this well for our audience today. So we're going to ask a little poll question here, and really try and understand a little bit better about some of the challenges that you're facing as part of your team specifically. So the question is, what is the biggest staffing challenge that's facing your procurement team? And we've got 4 options here. The first one being a small team with an increasing workload. The second one being maybe you're experiencing a lot of staff turnover, so maybe some of that retirement or burnout that we were talking about, or people leaving for the private sector. C, difficulty finding experienced procurement staff, so you've got a gap on your team, and now we're just trying to find somebody who can come in and deploy that experience in a way that helps your agency. Or perhaps there's another one that's potentially helping you more. So I'm just going to give those folks on the line just a couple more seconds to put in their response. And then Anthony, once those answers become clear, I'm going to ask you for your feedback and if those results are surprising. So we're just going to give you a couple more seconds here. Okay, we're going to close the poll. So what I'm seeing here, Anthony, is there's a pretty even split between those who are experiencing some staff turnover, as well as those with an increasing workload. So those being asked to do with more, and that can hardly be surprising based on what you just shared.
Yeah, and I mean, especially the small team with the increasing workload, that's kind of been, that's been the status of procurement for decades and decades. And I think that's just going to be more exemplified with this idea of the staff turnover, where we really are seeing a generational shift of all this talent leaving. So I think especially those top 2 options are really closely aligned, where as it was today and as it was 30 years ago, it was difficult enough for procurement to get the work done that they had. But with this maturing workforce, it's only going to be more amplified just with the lack of talent exiting. So that definitely doesn't surprise me at all.
And that ties well into the next point that I was hoping you could illuminate a bit for us here, which is that idea, and you alluded to this when you were talking about the implications for teams, is that role of technology. And I think it's really important for us to highlight specifically where that gap exists for a lot of teams, because I think it'd be fair to say most people on the line today have some form of digitization in their process. Whether it's a bidding or solicitation tool. Quite often we're working around the parameters of a financial system or an ERP system for the back end of things. But could you help explain a little bit more what we mean by that technology gap and exactly where that gap fits with respect to this talent gap that we're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the image on the screen here speaks pretty accurately to it, where whether it's through a state portal or whether it's through a website, whether it's through some type of posting and listing solution, I think most teams agree that in order to reach the broadest audience that we possibly can for our bids and RFPs, we have to post online.
Right.
And most teams have been forward-thinking enough to adopt that type of technology and again cast out those wide nets. And of course, there's tons of solutions out there to do that, and it's a good thing that's happening. Now, what's being represented here as this gap is that we post out these opportunities. Sometimes we receive in submissions digitally, sometimes we're getting them in paper. But the core component of how we actually do and make these bid and RFP decisions is being done in paper, in spreadsheets, and in email. Where really the most critical part of this process, it's great if we get in 10 different vendor submissions when we used to be getting in 3, but if we're not in a better position to actually manage those additional submissions, or we're not in a better position to do proper analysis of those submissions, then are we really even going to be further ahead? Where this is probably the biggest gap that exists, I think, in all of transit procurement, where we're making these huge high dollar decisions. They're highly regulated in the way that we need to approach them, but teams are still working in the same tools they've been working in for the past 50 years. And when it comes to awarding an RFP and chasing evaluators down.
And right, and the implication of that being that, without that experience and obviously being bogged down with a lot of tasks, being asked to do this in a way that's by its very nature inefficient and potentially ineffective, can really exacerbate this problem of not having enough bandwidth to complete projects.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's funny to me because when you look at, I mean, whenever I see something like this, I compare it to a sandwich, which maybe I shouldn't, but there's the one piece of bread is your online posting. The other piece of bread is the transaction that actually happens as a result of that decision. So both of the two things that we've automated with technology are mostly transactional.
Right. We
post something out online, it's interacted with, a submission comes in. Or on the other end, we make our decision, we post that out to the ERP system, and that, that's the input for the PO or that transaction. But that middle part, when we're engaging with stakeholders, when we're not doing analysis of options, for me, it's wild to me that that's still the part that teams are, still relying so heavily on paper and on Excel with.
Right.
And especially, I think that's definitely the biggest part where when you look at how do we actually put our people in the best position to make the best decision, I think that's definitely one of the first places we need to take a look at where that gap exists.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of why I wanted you to be part of today's session is because, I think it's really important for us to talk about the way, and we here typically refer to that gap space as the eSourcing space, where you want that kind of best of breed solution that helps empower people in the way that you've just described. And that's really the crux of what Anthony's going to be sharing with us on the session today, and brings us to the 3 ways that we think that eSourcing can help address these gaps. Building off of what Anthony said, the 3 that Anthony's going to help take us through really hinge on these 3 core ideas. That idea of automating the manual or administration type work so that your teams are free to do more with less time, but also really add value in the areas that they can add value, versus, copying or pushing paper is a common phrase. They can actually do the add value activities that they know are actually going to drive results for the organization. It's about operationalizing best practices so that you can onboard team members faster. You can train new team members faster. You can repeat processes or projects more easily with the confidence knowing that they were built right the first time. But also providing a purpose-built tool, unlike Excel or email, which are not purpose-made for procurement, obviously, to more manage your compliance and bring it all in one place. So that's a large part of what Anthony's going to be sharing with us today. So Anthony, I'm going to hand things to you here as we go through these 3 ways. And I might interject some questions here and there, but I'm just going to hand things over to you at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the first type of method here that we're looking at in terms of how technology or how teams can internally look at, helping fill or backfill that talent gap or that people gap is by using technology to gain efficiency and do more with less. So we just have some stats up here to just show some of the results that Bonfire actually does yield for some of our transit clients. So I mean, 200% faster projects. So if you can, I mean, this is simple math, but if you can do a project in twice as fast as you usually do, then how does that actually impact the people bandwidth that you have? If teams are struggling to do more work with less people, what if we could actually reduce the variable of time that's being, impacting in terms of how much projects those people can take on? The way that we can streamline the online workflow, the way that we can help you do some evaluation, dashboards for clear visibility. There's a lot of points here, but I think what I'll do, rather than just sit on the slide, is actually just hop into the platform here and give a really quick example of how Bonfire can help transit procurement teams do more with less, and use technology to automate what would typically be a really manual process. So I'll go ahead and actually hop into Bonfire here. And you can see my little picture up here on the right. And the first thing I'm looking at here is this Bonfire dashboard, where again, we have this very visual sense of all the different RFPs and all the different bids that we're actually working on. And while this won't be a full-fledged end-to-end kind of product demo, I do want to show you something very specific, which I think it's one of the more powerful instances of how we can help teams automate the way that they do manual processes today. And this is specifically going to be around how Bonfire can help teams automate line item bidding. So I'm going to go ahead and click into the supply quote project. So at Heart, which is the Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Agency, they run these supply quotes basically every 2 weeks. They're always buying new parts, and they basically created this where they can just push these out to market, get vendors to respond in, and do their analysis very quickly and do the award. So where the world used to be where someone would put this out, they would get in paper submissions, someone would take those paper submissions and cut and paste them into an Excel sheet. Bonfire automates all of that workflow from getting in a sealed digital Excel sheet, aggregating that data together, and then putting the procurement team in a position to do analysis rather than the aggregation of that data. So on the supply quote, I'll go ahead and click into the bid abstract that Bonfire creates for us automatically. So we can see we've had 5 different suppliers actually submit into this particular bid. Again, Bonfire accepts the digital submissions online, and we take all that data and aggregate it into the side-by-side view. And what I'll see here as the system loads up is we have 121 items that we were looking to get a quote on. I can see all of my items here across this far left column. And across my top row, I can see all of my different suppliers. And I can see that some suppliers have bid on some items, but they've opted not to bid on others if they didn't provide that type of item, or if they didn't provide a proper alternate. I could click into an item to get this side-by-side view to see exactly what my vendors have submitted. And I could go ahead and see who the lowest price option is and make an award off of there. So step 1 of this and how Bonfire is helping teams be less manual and more strategic is, again, we don't have to worry about working with suppliers, correcting this data, manually cutting and pasting this from Excel into a master spreadsheet. Bonfire does this automatic. And the second thing we do is we allow your team to, again, not build out these manual formulas to do different types of analysis, but Bonfire will do this for you automatic. So the first scenario that I'm going to run is, hey, Bonfire, show me what the lowest possible price I can get if I were just to cherry pick across all these items. So Bonfire goes through and it says, well, you know what, the best price we can get you, if you just want the lowest responsive across every single item, is $15,452. But in order to get that contract, we need to award 3 items to Barn Terry, we need to award 16 to G&G, 30 to Johnson & Bayer, et cetera, et cetera. And for some teams, this might be the end of it. And already Bonfire's saved your buying team a ton of time. We've reduced a ton of risk. And I could go ahead to my selection summary. I could export this to Excel. And it's this output that I'm going to use to put into my financial system. So it's in this way that we can help automate this middle evaluation part. But again, what Bonfire wants to do is put your team in a position to be more successful, or to help put your more junior buyers into a position where they can do more advanced analysis with the benefit of technology. So what I might be thinking here as a junior buyer is, okay, great, this is awesome. I can save a lot of money. Everyone's going to be happy. But the reality here is I might be taking on a lot of risk by working with these 5 different suppliers. There's a lot of contractual risk. There's a lot of administrative burden. So what I can do in Bonfire, just so I can understand this, is, well, okay, what does it look like if I only work with 1 supplier? And I can choose 1 vendor from my dropdown and hit go. Bonfire goes through and it says, if you want to work with 1 supplier, the best price we can get you is through Mecasel. And that price is $22,000. So it's actually a $7,000 or $8,000 increase. So it's almost a 50% increase in price. So again, I might be looking at this and saying, okay, well, I don't want to take on the risk of working with 5 different suppliers, but I know I don't want to work with just 1 and pay these $22,000. I still want to make sure that I'm making the best possible decision for my transit agency. So what I could do is say, okay, I don't want to work with 1. I don't want to cherry pick. What if I work with 2 suppliers? What does this middle ground option look like? And again, what I can do here in seconds is hit go, and Bonfire goes through and tells you what the optimal combination is of 2 suppliers. In seconds, I know I can cut a contract with Johnson & Bayer and Mecasel, and I can get my price down to $17,000, which is only $2,000 ahead of working with 5 different suppliers, but I've actually eliminated 3 suppliers that I would have to contract with. So an instance of this is where we can put, 1, your existing buyers in a position where they can work much more efficiently, and put them in a position where they're acting much more strategically. This also allows more junior staff to be able to look at something like this and lean on Bonfire to do the bulk of the work, and just put them in a position to choose what the best decision actually is. Again, no matter what way I want to slice and dice this, I can do all different types of mutations on this particular data sheet. The idea being is eventually I'd go to my Excel sheet, export this out, and again, that's what my input is going to be into the actual ERP system. But yeah, that's one way that Bonfire can completely eliminate the risk of getting in paper submissions, eliminate the manual task of cutting and pasting Excel together, and remove the burden of doing this type of analysis from your buyers while still allowing them to be very strategic.
Fantastic. Thanks for taking us through that, Anthony.
Yeah, no problem. So I'll go ahead and hop back into my dashboard just to queue us up here for the the second point, which I'll pull up in just a moment. So moving on from gaining efficiency and doing more with less, this point number 2 here is operationalization. Okay, you're gonna have to say this.
Operationalize best practices.
All right,
That's
I'll
okay.
stick to the demo part. Again, just to speak to some of the key benefits here, we can help you actually standardize the way that you're running your different bids and RFPs, allow you to have, as a manager, have more visibility to what junior staff might actually be doing. And a lot of this is accomplished through Bonfire's drafts and templates component here. So I'll go ahead and show you what this looks like within the system. The idea here is that, actually, before I hop into Bonfire, I'm going to pull up a document that we see a lot of our transit clients using just as a best practice. So I'm going to be speaking specifically to FTA regulations and then building the actual RFP or bid documents. So this document has been passed around a lot, and I think it was actually started from Dallas area regional transit. I might not be correct in that, but basically the idea here is that what teams are doing today is we have all these different regulations we need to abide by. We have all these different paths that we can go down in order to make a purchase. And what I can do is have this little guide that guides me what types of exhibits, what type of language do I need to actually put together in order to create the document. So as an example, if I'm buying some bus parts and I'm buying that with federal funds and we need to do a DBE consideration, I might be adding my cover letter, which is CS01, my schedule would be SO1, and my representations and certifications would be AO1. And I could just go down the list here and actually just choose of the proper mutations, which one do I actually need to assign to that specific draft or that specific template. So this is a good starting point to standardize this process, to put your team in a position where there's less room for error. But what we can do in Bonfire is actually augment this, where we can standardize and roll out these templates based on a predetermined set of templates. So I'll go ahead and hop through that right now. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my project templates. And in a real world scenario, I would probably have about 30 or 32 different templates just to make sure I capture all the different scenarios that are actually illustrated on that matrix. But I might be saying, okay, great, I'm running a supply RFP. I'm using my local funding. So what do I actually need to do to create this? So I can search for supply. I can see the template that Bonfire generates for me here. I can click into this, and baked into this template here are all the necessary files that I already know I need to use as part of this actual RFP. So again, the matrix is good for providing the guiding sort of lane for your junior staff to actually understand what to do. And Bonfire's template feature takes it the next step further, where you as a manager, you as a procurement leader, even just a more senior staff member, can standardize and roll out these templates so there's actually zero risk of error in terms of how we actually create this solicitation. What I could do beyond this template is, okay, great, all these standard and core details here are rolled out. The next thing I'm going to do is actually create a draft within Bonfire. And let's say I'm a brand new junior buyer, it's my first day, I'm all excited to run my first RFP here. Okay, great, I go in Bonfire, I know I need to use these documents, but I want to go ahead and actually just create a draft. And because I might not be 100% sure in what I'm doing just yet, I could actually use Bonfire's people functionality to go ahead and invite in other people to actually collaborate with me. So under editors, I might say, okay, well, Andy, you're not in here, Andy. I guess you're not on my portal, but I'll go ahead and invite in Angela instead. So Angela is my purchasing manager. I want her to be able to come in here and work with me collaboratively on the way we actually set up this project. So Angela will be able to log in and say, okay, great, you have these two other documents. But if I look back at my my actual guiding formula here, I can see we also need to bring in some other custom written or maybe some things from the internal client for the statement of work or the bid specifications. So I can bring in Angela here as someone who can help guide me and help work with me through this process. The other thing I might want to do here is actually invite in someone who's that internal client. So we can also invite in, let's say, Ani here, who's a member of she works in the warehouse. So she's going to help me design the bid spec for this particular supply RFP that we're going to be putting out. But again, there's two things that are happening here. One, Bonfire is allowing you to standardize all the different documentation that you need on an RFP or a bid, depending on the workflow that we actually need. And two, Bonfire is allowing more junior staff to be paired up with more senior staff, or for management to have visibility into what new staff are doing to make sure that everything's happening the right way. Versus if you're doing this in paper, if you're doing this in Excel, there's really no way for anyone to check into how that work is unfolding until it might be too late. This puts all leadership in a position to be proactive versus reactive when we are training staff or onboarding new members. So we can guide them and help them build this education, but allow them to actually meet what we need to do to spend grant money, or to make sure we're just not putting on any risk in the way that we make these decisions. But all those different processes can be built right into Bonfire. The last and third component that we have here is, hopefully I can pronounce this one, it's managing compliance more easily. That one was much easier.
It was.
And what we can do here, what Bonfire is allowing transit procurement teams to do, is reduce risk of error. So we've seen some elements of that already, but I'll go ahead and kind of demonstrate another part of Bonfire and how that works specifically. Allowing you to create more consistency and transparency. So not just in the way that we create a project, but what I'll be going through is specifically what it looks like once an RFP evaluation is done and what the actual report exports look like there. And that, of course, that feeds perfectly into having the complete audit report as well. Just by virtue of using a better tool set to manage the way that we evaluate a bid or an RFP, technology can make it where you can instantaneously pull out reports to justify spend to an auditor, someone from the FTA, anyone who wants to know, hey, how did you make this decision? Bonfire will have that data to back that up. So let me go ahead and hop into that right here now. So I'm going to dive into my dashboard and go into this completed RFP, this faculty and staff lunch catering service project. And this is one where Bonfire does allow you to connect with different stakeholders. They can log in, they can do their scoring within the platform. And in this example, Bonfire is automatically bringing all the different scorecards and all the different feedback from our entire evaluation committee team and bringing them into this one consolidated view. So Bonfire, again, makes it really easy for us to have all this data brought back together. It's done automatically. And if I want to make sure that, hey, we're putting forth the right decision, Bonfire can even do things like check for where there's a lack of consensus, which we can see with these orange highlighted boxes. The idea being, if this lack of consensus goes out to audit trail, or if it goes out to public record, it might add some additional risk for us when we actually go to, why this decision was made, or why these two people have such varying opinions on this particular decision. So as the buyer on this, Bonfire is identifying this for me. Now I can click into this project here to see the scoring summary, and Bonfire is automatically bringing all this data together. So when I look at the variety of food and offerings here, I can see exactly why this was flagged for a lack of compliance. One of my evaluators, Renata, gave this a 50% or a 12.5 out of 25. And then one of my buyers, Michael Scott here, gave this a really high score, a 23.75 out of 25. And for me as the buyer, we're not putting them in a position to do this data aggregation, but we want to make sure that we're putting something out that is going to be representative of the best decision we can make. So I can take a close look here at Renata's comments. This is all automatically captured by Bonfire. And Renata says she saw some good offerings, but she didn't see anything for any dinner options. Compared to Michael, he said a strong selection of food, but great services for large dinner events or more fun things we want to do. He especially liked how they had food trucks that were available to cater events as well. So Bonfire can't tell you who's right or who's wrong, but we can put your procurement team in a position to make sure that we're making the best possible decision for our transit agency, and that when this decision goes out to public record, that we feel confident in defending this if someone does want to challenge us. So this is an especially simple one. It looks like Renata just missed something, and Renata could go ahead and amend her score afterwards if that's what she feels is appropriate. But again, we're putting the procurement staff in a position to actually facilitate this discussion. Beyond this, beyond just bringing the data together within the platform, we make it extremely simple for you to export the data out as well. And seeing as how we've only seen a part of this RFP, you might be asking the question as well, how did we actually get here? What does Bonfire actually cover in this workflow? We can export a full report of exactly what happened in this Microsoft Word report, which is basically an executive summary of everything that had happened. So I can go ahead and pull this out. And what we can see here on this report is a perfect summary of everything that's happened, where I can see all the critical detail of what were the administrative details of this project. As of right now, who is our highest scoring supplier? When specifically did we unseal each piece of vendor information? When did each of our evaluation committee members sign off on the conflict of interest? There's a place for all of our stakeholders to actually sign off and verify that, yes, this is exactly what I think and believe. There's a place where we can see all vendor questions and all of our answers built into this audit trail. All of our public notices for notices of addenda or schedule change, there's a complete audit trail of all of that as well. In addition to that, all of our internal discussion, things that the buyer might be communicating to the actual evaluation committee. I can see a full timestamp record of all of my vendor submissions. Whoops, and I accidentally clicked on that email. Let me get out of that. I can also see all the project criteria exactly as we developed it. And then the same scoring summary we just saw in Bonfire exported up here. Again, if anyone has any questions on how was this decision made, how are you going to justify this spend, whatever it might be, Bonfire is making sure that we have a completely ironclad decision and a completely complicit report that shows exactly what we went through. So you don't have to lean on, or worry about leaning on the inexperience of a more junior buyer when Bonfire is guiding them through this best practice process and making sure that we're dotting all of our I's and crossing all of our T's along the way automatically.
Even speaking from the experience of a lot of procurement teams who are using paper and Excel and email, trying to stitch this together, you mentioned things like FTA and the risk of being audited, which can be a very common occurrence, is how much time it would take to almost forensically, like in the TV show CSI, just try and stitch this email train with these pieces of paper. And that's not only is that extremely risky, but it's extremely time consuming.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I'm sure everyone on the line knows this just as well as I do, but a common experience to create this report is I'm in my email and I'm taking screenshots of questions the vendor has asked, or I'm scanning in a paper bid that I've gotten from a supplier so I can put it in this electronic copy. Mm-hmm. I have all these different types and sources of information that I'm trying to bring together. And you're right, that in itself is a huge time sink, let alone the risk of the data actually being incorrect or not being representative of what we need.
Right.
So to not have to worry about that, to have that audit trail to make sure that we are running an FTA compliant decision,
right.
That's something that's been critically important to the client, to our transit agencies who are using us today.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking us through that, Anthony. The last thing that I wanted to help your help with was, we've gone through the gaps, we've gone through what they mean, the implications, some ways that eSourcing and technology can help alleviate those. Mm-hmm. I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to add some extra flourish to that in terms of the context of an actual client experience. And you've highlighted 3 different clients that you wanted to talk really briefly about. Could you take us through kind of what each one was looking for in terms of that gap and then how we help them address it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the interesting thing about these 3 stories as well is they're all really relevant to the topic of the webinar, which is we were facing problems before due to a lack of people or due to a lack of bandwidth, and how has technology or how has process change allowed us to actually address that. So starting with MTC, so the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, they're out of the Bay Area in California. So they were working, they're kind of like the classic status quo of most transit orgs we speak to, where they were advertising online and doing their transactions in their financial system, but running all of their bids and RFPs in paper and in Excel. And just by moving those processes into a more digital format, we've gone through some of the results already, but they were able to increase the efficiency of the project by 200%. So cut it down from, I think it was 120 days down to 60 days on average for an RFP.
Wow.
They're, again, able to reap all these other benefits, but for me, this is the most simple one. If there's a way where we can allow our people to do more with less, and we know no one's in a position to add headcount, that's just the reality.
Right.
So what type of investments can we make to allow these people to be more effective? And I think given the gaps that exist and given the problems that exist as well, technology is probably one of the first places where we can allow our people to go through an RFP, and we can run 2 RFPs in the time that we run 1.
Right.
Right. That seems like a really easy multiplier to add in an early part of the formula to make sure we can be more efficient.
Right.
The second story here is with TARC, who was actually one of the first agencies to buy electronic buses, leveraging no-low grants from the FTA. So for those of you who haven't been to Louisville in the summer, it is a dip in the Ohio Valley. So while it seems like it's all in vogue right now for everyone to move towards more sustainable or electronic transit, there was actually a really pressing issue for them to do this a while back, just because all the smog and all the pollution would actually dip into that Ohio Valley. So for TARC, again, they were dealing with some of the same issues. They had a limited amount of procurement staff. They had experts who knew exactly what they were talking about, but they were in different locations across the organization. So Bonfire could be a really easy way for them to connect with those experts and make sure we're very accurately getting a good sense of what that bid spec is and working collaboratively in terms of understanding what the market is, what our actual requirements are. I mean, if anyone's worked on an electronic bus bid out there, it's not just the buses and getting the cheapest one, but it's how long does the battery last and how does it align with the plan that we're actually building to charge these things and how many stations do we need, right? It's a full service offering in a huge project. And it's also one that's typically funded by these no-low grants coming from FTA. So we got to make sure we get it right, and Chart used Bonfire to actually coordinate and collaborate with their internal stakeholders to drive that innovation and drive that advancement. Where maybe the more junior procurement person didn't have the experience of the chief transit planner, we created a really easy digital mechanism for them to kind of sap that brain knowledge and just work collaboratively on that project.
Right.
And the last one here is PSTA, which is based out of the Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority, so in St. Pete's in Florida.
Okay.
And they're likely the case study that's most directly impacted to the #1 challenge that teams are seeing here, where they were bleeding staff. They had tons of staff retiring. They were seeing the shifts of that generational retirement happening in real time. So they really bought Bonfire and were able to leverage Bonfire to standardize the different way that we can build the templates on the front end for RFPs going out to market. So they were one of the organizations, or one of the many organizations, who's leveraging this template here in conjunction with Bonfire. So their documentation is standardized. The director at PSDA, Al, has visibility into what his buyers are up to. So he has a really good line of sight into making sure that they're not making any mistakes. And Bonfire is also working with Al, by defining the process to make sure that they really have some bumpers on the rails versus them being able to fly off the handle.
Right.
So between allowing the existing staff to be more efficient, allowing the existing staff to plug in better with resources across a transit agency, and allowing existing leadership to work more collaboratively with the new staff that are coming in. Bonfire I think is definitely a good way for teams to explore how can we maximize the talent that we have today, but also nurture them to be successful senior procurement agents as they progress in their career.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking us through that, Anthony, and thank you for joining us on today's session. It's been really great to have you here and share a lot of your insight. Again, I know you've spoken to hundreds of transit and transportation agencies across the U.S. and helping bring to bear a lot of that knowledge to today was excellent. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks.
I would recommend, if anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about some of those client studies, we've got some of those on our website. So I'd recommend that you go to gobonfire.com, where you'll find not only those case studies, but also other webinars and resources that are available to you to learn a little bit more. So really appreciate that. We do want to give everyone a little bit of time back in their day here. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to open up to a little bit of Q&A. Again, this is a really good, this is a great opportunity for you to pick the brain of Anthony while we have him here. And so if there's any questions you have about either these processes or the subject matter that Anthony's talked about or some of these case studies, please feel free to ask those questions. And over the next few minutes, we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. I'm also going to try and group as many of these questions sort of logically together in an effort to get through as many of them as we can. So, Anthony, I'm going to start with the question here that we can see here about, it seems to be about vendors and getting vendors engaged, and I guess generally speaking, just getting vendors on board with something like this. In your experience, what sort of advice would you have for a transportation agency looking to get their vendors on board with this kind of platform?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. And I mean, vendor engagements obviously is a critical part of any successful procurement team. So I think the best piece of advice I could give is to actively communicate with your vendors and understand what they want. I mean, I think in this day and age, we are seeing definitely a more trend towards vendors wanting to use more type of technology to do electronic submissions and be able to view more information readily. But I mean, the simplest piece of advice I could give is just to ask them. The other piece of advice I would give is when you do, let's say you do decide that you want to partner with some type of technology firm to create that type of digital workflow for your suppliers, make sure that you're calling into other organizations to get a really good sense of exactly how their client support or their customer success team works with the suppliers. speaking just on behalf of Bonfire, I know that we do provide unlimited training for vendors and unlimited training for really all stakeholders. So that definitely helps vendors ease into that with, when you have training, you have someone you can call, and that someone also isn't, on the procurement staff, just so it doesn't take away from their time either.
Right.
But yeah.
It's good that you said that, because I can see a few questions here around the training or onboarding process, and I'm projecting a bit here, but we've talked a lot about how teams are already struggling to keep up with the growing demand, and so when you think about adopting a new software, the thought of taking buyers or procurement folks out of that train, out of those bowling lanes,
Right. Yeah.
and taking them on the sort of sidelines and getting them ramped up can seem like a pretty arduous thing, and obviously can turn a lot of people off from implementing that kind of change management.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the questions that I'm seeing here, maybe you can help answer in terms of, what should implementation look like, or what should they expect when it comes to implementation, and how does it help offset, getting people back into the trenches, as it were, and becoming effective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even taking a step back from that, there's definitely a shift that's happening with all software, where you're not just buying a piece of software and it's on-prem and you got to kind of figure it out. But with new types of SaaS offerings, you're not just buying the software, but you're also buying the service that comes with it. And I do think that Bonfire is leading the way in this type of regard in public sector purchasing or public sector procurement, where a typical onboarding at Bonfire lasts about 4 weeks. It's a highly structured training sessions that happen in the beginning. It's about 10 hours of training with a dedicated one-on-one resource. And really the whole goal is to get those live projects in Bonfire where you have a dedicated implementation specialist who's holding your hand and making sure that things go well. So I mean, our success at Bonfire is your success as an organization. So the more aligned you can be on that, then the more likelihood there is for that success to actually happen. But I would just pick a solution that is definitely cloud-based and one that has really strong support and service offering to support the team to make sure things are rolling really easily.
Awesome. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question here, and I'm seeing a few comments around like how to get this through internally. And I guess what it comes down to is achieving that internal buyer or stakeholder buy-in. Right? We're talking about, we don't necessarily have the funds to hire another FTE or another team member or backfill. So what advice do you have to those on the line today? If they're looking at e-sourcing platforms, what advice do you have to them in terms of getting maybe executive or leadership buy-in into a platform like this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the best thing I can say, and really a critical factor that's been important with all the transit agencies I've worked with so far, is no one is in a position to add that, that FTE headcount. They're not in a position to add the benefits that come with that. So the good news is that Bonfire is much less expensive than what a full-time employee would cost. And the idea being, again, when you look at adding a full-time employee, like that's going to add, let's say we have a team of 5, that's going to add an additional 20% of productivity, assuming that all team members are adding the same volume. But if I can allow each of my different 5 team members to be 30% more effective by just buying one cheaper piece of technology, I mean, for me, that's a much more sound business case in terms of how can we allow and maximize the resources that we have today to, again, allow them to do more with less. So I think that's definitely the way that you can at least phrase the argument in terms of the specifics, in terms of, well, how do we actually buy this technology? What is the business case based on? It's definitely based on mitigating risk. It's definitely based on efficiency. The sad part is that for some transit teams, they don't get the funds to invest into this type of technology until there's a literal breaking point, when people start leaving or until there's a big litigation issue or something of that nature. So the other perspective I would give is you don't want to wait until you hit that breaking point to make this type of change, versus investing in technology today to be more proactive versus reactive in terms of investing in the staff that you already have.
Right. Great.
Yeah.
No, good points. Again, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to close the session here, being respectful of your time and give you some time back. But we definitely appreciate so many of you showing up today and taking in today's session. I hope you found it informative and insightful. Again, if there's anything that you want to learn more about what we do or about how we solve problems like that, I'd encourage you to visit our website. But again, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope you have a great end of your week. Thank you so much.
Yeah, happy Independence Day or Canada Day, everyone. Take care.